folks, it's time to assess and caress with Donald Osborne.
If you love classic cars, then Donald loves you.
Love that. Hi, everyone. I'm Eddie Alterman, Chief Brand Officer at Hearst Autos. You probably know today's guest from his segments like that on Jay Leno's Garage or his writing in sports car market. Donald Osborne is the CEO of Audrain, as well as one of the world's foremost appraisers and historians, and he's a real leading light in our hobby. Welcome to the 14th episode of Inside Track, Donald. Great to have you.
Thanks, Eddie. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, you've had a crazy career. You started as an opera singer, then got into television, TV and advertising, and then you became like a huge appraiser of classic cars. How did that happen?
Well, that's sort of the story. You left out three different careers as well in that, because we actually only have an hour here. This is not the 9-part mini-series that you and I had spoken about originally. But I actually started with art. I was an art major in high school, and I was a car-mad kid. Even though growing up in New York City, I didn't grow up with a car family. My family didn't actually buy their first car until I was 12 years old, because living in Manhattan and then later in Queens, we didn't need a car. We had the subway and the bus. But I was absolutely fascinated by cars, and I thought, well, as somebody who's interested in art and cars, where does that come together? I'll be a car designer. And so as an art major in high school, I thought that was going to be my path. But I'd also started to sing when I was in junior high school. And I discovered that friends of mine who had studied singing in high school were going to go to college for it. And I thought, ooh, that sounds easy. So I thought I didn't want to really work at art. So I went to school instead for opera, and then worked in retailing, as you said, while I was pursuing my operatic career. Cars were always in the background. They never, ever went away. But it all came together in a way that I can shorten the story, because I want everybody to read my autobiography, which I'm working on, which will be done in about 40 or 50 years. The idea that I would come back to cars one day was not very far from my mind, and I'm extremely fortunate that I did back in 2004 when I started my appraisal business, Automotive Valuation Services. And it's led to where I am here in Newport, Rhode Island today, and with this amazing collection of cars, great people, and having more fun than I could possibly imagine at this age.
That's fantastic. I think everyone's envious of your path and how much you've experienced and how much joy you've put into the world. I want to ask you about your appraising role. How do you do your research?
Well, actually, that's probably the most fun part of the appraisal business, and it's probably the thing that really connected me to it. My very good friend, Dave Kinney, who's a terrific appraiser and also a great writer, was the one, we were colleagues together, and he suggested that when I thought that the marketing communications business was really not where I wanted to be, that I become an appraiser, because I always enjoyed doing the research. I had been doing some catalog writing for some of the auction companies, and I stopped doing that because, quite frankly, I couldn't be paid the amount of money for the time that I took doing it. I had more fun doing the research than I did the actual writing of the descriptions. And so with that background, looking at cars the way I'd love to look at cars from the time I was a little boy, the next step in terms of doing an appraiser's job the proper way is to look at a car as an object, figure out what its attributes of value are, research those, find out other cars which have comparable attributes of value, and therefore come up with a credible opinion of value. And that is the most exciting part of the appraisal process for me. Seeing great cars, looking at them very closely, examining them, and then figuring out sort of where they fit in the world of cars.
How do you do a car that has no comp? Like, let's say the Ferrari 375 MM, the Bergman Coupe. It's a one-off. It's incredibly special. How do you assess that?
Well, the first thing is that you mentioned in your question a car that has no comps. Every car has a comp. It may not have an exact comparable. if you are appraising a 1966 Mustang convertible, then yes, it's fairly easy to find exact comparables, other 1966 Mustang convertibles with the same specification, with a similar provenance, in similar condition. But for a car like this car, which is an amazing car, one of my favorite cars on the planet, in fact, what we do is use something which is adapted from real property appraisal, which is called the principle of substitution. If I did not have this particular car, what else might I have? And that then becomes the comparable set. So the attributes of value, rarity, the mark, Ferrari, celebrity noted ownership, condition, Pebble Beach class winning and Pebble Beach best of show winning car. So then you look at your set of cars that match those criteria, and then you draw your comparable set. And it's actually, of course, much more interesting as an appraiser to work on a car like this because of the challenge of it, and because you get to spend time with beautiful cars.
So off of the top of your head, 65 million, something like that?
One of the things, and this is going to sound like a terrible cop-out, but all of my colleagues and instructors that I took courses with for the American Society of Appraisers will slap me on the back for this. I cannot give an opinion of value without having an appraisal work file. If I were to state, it would be an appraisal, and someone can actually come to me and hold me to that. I will say that I think that your opinion of value is not necessarily out of line.
Well, you can't fault a guy for trying, and I appreciate your professional ethics there. But you have a real responsibility because of your role to the collector car market. You know, your opinion really moves the market. So, you know, what do you feel is that responsibility?
Well, Eddie, I think that it is the most important responsibility is to make sure that I am looking at an object, any professional appraiser is looking at an object for what it is, and deciding based on his or her own experience, their connoisseurship, and the depth of research that they do, that we place it in its proper place in the marketplace, regardless of what we may feel emotionally. I have very, very deep emotional feelings about a lot of cars, and that's one of the things, frankly, that is one of the most important parts about the segment that I do on Jay Leno's Garage. Jay and I talk about the cars that I choose for the segment, talk about what their attributes are, what makes them interesting, what makes them perhaps not so interesting. And then I look at how they performed in the marketplace in the last 5 years. And it's often interesting to see that cars which are fascinating and really interesting may not be cars that the market cares much about. And cars that the market cares a great deal about and that have appreciated a great deal may not be the most interesting cars. So it's looking objectively. That's the key attribute of an appraiser and one of the most important responsibilities. One of the other things that I say as well, because in addition to appraising, I also do consulting. And that, in fact, is actually appraisal and consulting is how I ended up here in Newport at the Audrain. I was first referred to the partners who founded the Audrain Automobile Museum by Jay Leno to appraise the collections, the Audrain collections here, back in 2015. And I came up and I did an appraisal of the collections and then began to act as a consultant for the additions to the collection. And one of the things that is so important is understanding the fact that while cars can be important investment assets, cars must be purchased because they fill a collecting need, a collecting desire. They satisfy a certain itch for reliving history, for preserving history, for sharing history. And the car right behind me, the other way, is an amazing example of that. It's a 1964 Porsche 904, which was purchased by the Audrain collections from the California State University at Fullerton, part of the Nick Begovich bequest to the university. And it's literally the most original Porsche 904 on the planet. It's covered less than 3,000 kilometers from new and is completely original. So the responsibility in looking at a car like this and evaluating it, comparing it to other comparable cars, is a very important one, because this is a car which, to your point about having comparables, there are many 904s, but there are very few 904s that have these particular attributes. And that's one of the things that I try to look at as an appraiser and also as a consultant, making sure that people buy cars because they love them, they connect with them. For me personally, if I love a car, if it takes me to the places I want it to take me, to the shows, rallies, tours, whatever it might be, and the next day after I buy it, someone's only willing to pay me half of what I paid for it, it doesn't really matter because the car hasn't changed. What the car does for me has not changed. The market is variable. It depends on taste. It depends on the needs of the market. In the current market we're in right now, it's very much one which is attracted to usability, to experiential ownership. People are not generally buying cars to look at. They want to drive their cars. And that's a very important market driver that as an appraiser, I have to be aware of.
So to your point, thinking objectively about the market, what are the 3 cars you'd buy right now to hold, to use and to hold, to use on vintage rallies perhaps, but something where you could see, okay, this is a car that the market is going to reward, and over 20 or 30 years, we're going to realize some value here. I know we're not supposed to think that way, but let's just pretend for a second.
Well, Eddie, it's a very funny thing. Not only are we not supposed to think that way, although I did lose my election to be elected emperor of the world to command how everybody collects cars. Perhaps there will be a new round of elections, and I can run in a couple of decades. But
yeah, 4 more years.
I think that it's most important before I pick the cars that I would choose. I can't really say for the market because literally it's somewhat like, and I'll get into a great deal of trouble here, but that's fine. Stock market analysts to whom you listen at the end of the day who tell you why the market did something and how. If they actually knew, they would not be reporting on radio and TV. They would be sitting on their yachts in the Mediterranean because they'd be trillionaires if they could know what the market was going to do. If I knew what car would double in value in 25 years, I wouldn't tell you. I'd buy it and sell it to you in 15. But I think that you can generally look for cars that have, as I said, broad appeal. The cars that have broad appeal and historic interest are those cars that are going to lead the market in appreciation. And certainly if a market is in a downturn, will hold their value better than some other cars. So cars that people can actually drive. Also behind me here, you can't see, is a great Formula One race car, a 1997 Ferrari F310B. It's driven by Michael Schumacher and Eddie Irvine. And it is a car of a period that can be driven, albeit with factory support, but can be driven because the starting procedures and the computers necessary are not so exotic and so rare that the car cannot be used. There's a sharp drop-off in the prices of Formula One cars when you get away from cars which a very talented owner might drive him or herself to those cars that can only be operated by a factory-trained technician and factory-trained driver. So again, that's one of the things that looking for cars that have important historical interest, and now they don't have to be very expensive cars. By all the traditional rules of collecting, a Ford Mustang from 1964 to 1966 should not have much value at all. They made millions of them after all, and it's a fairly common car. But it's also a car that spoke very directly to a generation of people and continues to speak to generations of people. I know guys that are in their 20s and 30s who their parents were kids when the Mustang was new. And they love Mustangs because it speaks to a certain time, a certain feeling, and cars like that are always going to be important market cars. They may not be the cars that appreciate 60%, but you won't lose money on the cars. You can buy a good one, maintain it well, use it, and basically drive it for free. And I think to ask more of that than a car that is ridiculous.
Yeah, I hear you. So let's talk about using cars. I know you just did the 2021 Mille Miglia, and I want to hear about that experience. And what was it like after the world sort of opened up in time for that event?
Well, Eddie, I'll tell you this. It was very emotional for a couple of reasons. One, this is actually my 5th Mille Miglia experience, and I used to spend 3 months of the year living and working in Italy. And so Italy is very close to me. I'm very close to Italy. And to be back in Italy for the first time in over a year and to see how the country was opening up, to feel the spirit of the people, because the Mille Miglia was the first big international event Italy had held since the country had opened up. And people were thrilled to see the cars again, to experience this. And also, the Mille Miglia is almost impossible to describe to anybody, because you can say, well, yes, okay, you spend 30 hours over 4 days in an old car, in this case, an 80-year-old car we were driving, and which is hot, noisy, very, very rough suspension, and you can see in this video we're bouncing across the cobblestones. You see in this picture the car is covered with this wonderful fine dust. There was basically no way to get air into the interior, so we had a hose rigged in the front grille that brought fresh air into the interior of the car, which is great, except for the fact that some of the special stages were unpaved, so we were covered with silt and dust during those stages. And we still had smiles on our faces because it was extraordinary. My co-driver is a colleague here at the Audrain, a fellow Antonio Meligari, who was actually born in Brescia, of an American mother and Italian father. They brought him back to America when he was 3 or so months old. He'd been back a few times to visit relatives, but to bring him back to Brescia, the place he was born, to do this amazing event, it was astonishing. And I have to say that he did an amazing job, because you see the video camera there. He was videotaping the event and navigating and absolutely geeking out over all the cars and motorcycles he saw on the road. So it was an amazing experience in 89-degree heat. It must have been about 100 in the car, but it was thrilling. This car that we drove, a 1940 Seata 1100 Viotti aerodynamic coupe, had actually done the Mille Miglia in 1940. And at a certain point in the road, we were driving alongside a 1938 Fiat 508C aerodynamic coupe that also did the 1940 Mille Miglia. So it was as if we were back 80 years ago on these amazing roads. The emotional experience that the Mille Miglia is cannot be exaggerated, but it is a trial. It is an absolutely epic event that takes everything out of you physically, emotionally, and mentally. But it was a thrill.
Right. You get no sleep. Your allergies are going crazy, but it's the greatest time you ever had in your life. And what were some of the cars that really turned you on, that you saw, that you were running with?
Well, one of the things, this picture shows us we've arrived in Rome, and we're just about to take a drive down the Via Veneto in Rome, and then a nighttime tour around the city, which is quite wonderful. But I'd probably say one of the really special moments was the first night we stopped and we parked in the garage of the hotel, and opposite us was one of the Mercedes W194 race cars with its roof-mounted air brake. And, just another car in the Mille Miglia, just parked in the garage here with us. And, that's what it's all about. I mean, cars that had amazing historic importance. Mercedes-Benz, to honor the late Sir Sterling Moss, brought 722, the great 1955 Mercedes SLR, back to the event. They didn't run it in the event, but they had it at the Mille Miglia Museum at the start when we were having lunch. And they started the car up and drove it away. And it was absolutely amazing to feel in your chest the vibrations from that straight 8 engine. It was astonishing.
Yeah, I mean, think about what Moss achieved, 10 hours in that car, average 100 miles an hour. It's astonishing. I think it's one of the greatest achievements in motorsport. And what's great is that the record still stands, because they shut the event down 2 years later. So wonderful. Wonderful.
It does fill you with awe and wonder. Now, granted, when we're driving on these roads, they were not closed to the public. And during the Mille Miglia di Velocità, the original Mille Miglia, the roads were more or less open or slightly closed. I often joke about the fact that Sterling Moss achieved something absolutely heroic, but as opposed to people like me, who have driven in the Mille Miglia Storica, or even the people in 1955 who drove in Fiat Cinquecentos, they started at midnight, drove all night long, and then were passed by Sterling Moss at 10 o'clock in the morning, since he started at 7:22 and he ended at 5:30 in the afternoon. You didn't have to drive in the dark. It was a walk in the park. I mean, come on, the fastest car and a good horn.
And Jenks notes, right?
Exactly.
Don't forget Jenks.
He knew which way. Those rolling notes. He knew which way the road was going to turn. Poor Antonio and I said to Antonio, so which way do we go next? He said, left. Oh yes, it's after that right. And so, you know, we sort of slid around the corner and there we were. And it was great. So yeah, we had a good time.
That's fantastic. So tell us about your new role at Audrain. I know you're overseeing a tremendous amount of activity there. So how do you bring your skills to bear on all this multifarious activity?
Well, it's quite interesting because, as I mentioned earlier, I've done 5 completely different things in my life, from art to music to advertising to retailing. And interestingly enough, all of those things have come together in what it is that I'm doing now. My experience serving on the boards of not-for-profits, my experience as a performer, my experience with museums, my experience in art, my experience with cars, valuation, has all come together because this is an extraordinary organization here, centered around the Audrain Automobile Museum, which was founded in 2014 and has quickly become, I think, one of the most vital and moving museums in the country and certainly around the world. We do 4 different exhibitions a year in our gallery here in Newport, as well as fulfilling our mission to celebrate, preserve, and share automotive history. We bring our cars out. Every car in the collection runs and drives. We bring them on tours, rallies, the Mille Miglia, the California Mille. We take them to Goodwood Festival of Speed. We go to shows around the world, the Pebble Beach Concours d'Elegance. Of course, we show cars here at our Audrain Newport Concours as well. And so we share the cars as much as we can. We also produce cars and coffee events. We do, I think, 14 or 16 cars and coffee events from May through the end of October. There on the screen, you see a Concours, cars and coffee event that was held during a 2019 Concours and Motor Week. We had over 450 cars at historic Fort Adams here in Newport, and the Queen Mary came. We tried to get the Queen Mary to pay a registration fee, but they refused, so they couldn't get their coffee. But it's really exciting because one of the things, too, that is so dynamic about this organization is that we are growing very quickly. We took something that was the lemon of the pandemic and the need to shut down for 2 months last year and turned it into quite wonderful lemonade. We established and relaunched our YouTube channel where we post 2 new videos every week of cars in the collection being driven, motorcycles in the collection being ridden, stories of our exhibitions, virtual openings and tours of our exhibitions, and the new series that we started with me and Jay called Mansions and Motor Cars, celebrating great houses and great cars. And that has become something which has given the Audrain amazing visibility. I was at the Goodwood Festival of Speed a few weeks ago, and I was astonished to have tons of people walk up to me and say, I was wearing my Audrain cap, and they said, wow, the Audrain, yes, we know about that. We see your wonderful videos. I thought, that's amazing. You know, it's our little museum in Newport, Rhode Island, and here it is being celebrated in the UK, thousands of miles away. The picture that you're seeing right now is one taken during the 2019 Audrain Newport Concours and Motor Week at an event called The Gathering, which is a luxury lifestyle event held at the estate of Doris Duke, Rough Point. And the 3 cars that are there on the lawn are part of the Audrain collections, all of which have a connection to Doris Duke. The Duesenberg Model J Murphy town car was commissioned and owned by her mother, Nanaline Holt Inman Duke. The 1938 Packard Rolston Landaulet was ordered by Doris Duke when she was 26 years old. And then a Cadillac limousine that was used by Doris to commute between Duke Farms in New Jersey and her place here in Newport. And so one of the things that we really like to celebrate here is living history. I mentioned before that the market itself is celebrating experiential ownership, and we are all about the experience of owning cars and using them. We have a quarterly magazine called Linkage that celebrates the automotive life and talks about all the things that people do with their cars and for their cars. And it's sort of where we are and what we stand for. And it's something that speaks very, very deeply to me because I love cars. I love cars to drive. Cars are wonderful art. Again, here's my art background. They're great sculpture, but they're kinetic sculpture. And cars to me are at their highest use when you can hear them and smell them and feel the vibrations and see the light pass across them as they drive by. I mean, it's amazing. I pinch myself every day that I get to do what I do.
It is incredible. I mean, if Doris Duke were alive today and she was a 26-year-old Instagrammer, she probably wouldn't be buying the Packard. she
well, given who Doris was, who knows? She might have actually, as a 26-year-old Instagrammer, influencer, TikToker, probably would have commissioned a Maybach Landaulet with an AMG GT engine in it. You know, you never know.
So it's sort of the modern analog, right?
Exactly.
So we've only got a few minutes left. I wish we had a few hours. A few minutes left before we go to some questions from the crowd. But what advice would you give to someone looking to build a collection today?
First and foremost, and this is what I do when I meet with consulting clients, I sit down and ask, what do you want to do with your car? Do you like to show cars? Do you like to drive cars? Do you like to do rallies? Do you like to vintage race? Do you like to have track days? Because there's nothing more unfortunate when someone buys a car, perhaps the right car, for the wrong reason, or the wrong car for the right reason. They prize originality because they collect antiques and art, and they say, I want a car that's completely original, that's untouched, and an absolute object of history. And then they say, okay, now I want to enter a 1,000-mile rally and drive this car in it. So that's a disconnect immediately there. Or someone who says, well, I really don't care if the car shows its life and traces of use. I want a car to drive. They said, oh, but a friend of mine told me about this class at the Pebble Beach Concours d'Elegance. I'd like to enter my car. Again, a disconnect. And also to look to see what you can do with your cars. There are people who build very large collections very quickly, but then discover that they don't have the infrastructure to maintain a collection, and cars get very unhappy if they're undriven. And especially going back to thinking of cars as investments. Cars can be investments, but they're investments that require an investment. Just sitting in a dark garage alone, time will take its toll on a car as opposed to a share certificate. So you have to keep that in mind before you buy. And the last and probably most fundamental thing is fit. And people say, oh, do you mean panel fit? I said, no, personal fit. You can love a car, but actually turn out you can't fit in the car yourself physically and drive it. There's nothing more miserable than being unhappy and uncomfortable in a car that you want to have fun in.
And what advice would you give to someone looking to emulate your career, to get into the appraisal business?
Well, that one's slightly easier. I think spend all the time you can observing cars, talking to people, asking questions. I have learned so much from so many people over the years, and it was all of that investigation, the reading that I've done. I'm still a voracious reader. I could spend days just sitting in a room reading. Read as much as you can. Speak to as many people as you can at car shows, at events. Talk to the owners of the cars, the restorers of the cars. Get to know what makes the cars special, and then look at the marketplace. There's lots of online resources now, so you can follow auctions, look at prices, look at dealer prices, look at what the cars have sold for, and make those connections. Figure out what is the connection between this particular car, its equipment, its history, and the price it realizes in the market. And that gives you the background to develop the connoisseurship to come up with opinions of value that are credible. And then I would say, if you're interested in a career as an appraiser, associate yourself with one of the known professional associations for appraisers. As I said before, I'm a member of the American Society of Appraisers, which is the world's largest interdisciplinary appraisal group, with certification in everything from real property to gems and jewelry. I'm a personal property appraiser with a specialty in automobiles. And these organizations will require a great deal of experience and specific training in the principles of valuation and in your specific field to make sure that you really know what you're doing and that you can be credible and useful and for your clients and for the industry itself.
Fantastic. Yes, adding value, as they say. Okay, let's take some questions. This one's from Brian. Put you on the spot, but I think you can handle these. This will maybe a little bit repetitive. I'm going to ask it anyway. Where do you think the values for older classics from the 20s, 30s, 40s will go in the next few decades?
That's a great question, and one which is asked quite often. And the answer is that the best of any period will continue to be of interest and will continue to appreciate. What we have seen is, as the collecting field grows, I was remarking to a friend the other day that it's astonishing to me that, cars from 1992 are now 30 years old. And when I first became interested in cars, and people asked me, how did you get into the collector car market? I said the used cars I drove, which were interesting cars, became collector cars. So as the collecting market grows, as newer cars come into it, the older cars will continue to show appreciation and importance if they are important examples. I know, in fact, I'm sitting not far away from a colleague of mine who's a young man who is absolutely crazy for Packards of the 1930s. It seems to be not very logical, but nonetheless, there's something about the design and engineering of those cars that speak to him, and because, of course, Packard made some of the best cars in the 1930s. There are a lot of forgettable cars in the 1930s, and they're not going to fare very well in the marketplace, not because they're from the 1930s, but because they're not interesting cars.
But in general, there's sort of a generational tracking that happens. The cars that people wanted in high school, now that they have money, they can now afford, and it creates a bit of a market. And I think you're seeing that with cars like RX-7s, FD RX-7s, and stuff from the 90s that are really great. Even R107s, to your point, those SLs, they made tons of them, but people love them so much that they're really rising in value. So it's cool to see.
Yeah, Eddie,
here's another
the traditional collector car bell curve is still very much in action, but I would say there's probably a second curve that occurs probably a decade or so afterwards that we're seeing now that the collecting hobby has matured as it has.
Interesting. Okay, here's an interesting one. Your thoughts on levels of restoration, authenticity, correctness, originality, refreshed finishes, and mechanical updates on overall value. Is it better to be original, or is it better to be perfectly presented? It's like the Ralph Lauren question.
The answer to that question is yes. It depends on a couple of things, and in fact, it's quite interesting. I'm about to do 2 seminars on this topic, one at the Pebble Beach Forum and one here in the Audrain Newport Concours and Motor Week seminar series with my good friend Miles Collier. It depends on what your particular interests are. The market in general, and it's very difficult to make generalized statements in a macro way about the market today because it's quite specific. But in general, the market prefers the original. Now, the original is something which has to be taken with a caveat. If a car is completely original, as this 904 behind me is, then its use is very limited. You can't take this car out and drive it every weekend because then you would be potentially damaging its essential originality, which is a part of what makes it important. So for this purpose, if you want to drive a car, then you want a restored 904. And you might want one with a hotter engine, a newer engine that was put in. Because again, the 904 was built primarily as a race car. This is a street example, but as a race car. And race cars frequently had their engines replaced after events or for specific uses. So a race car with a replaced engine that has been restored may have as much value if the history is good as a completely original car with no notable history at all, but worn finishes. The other thing we have to watch out for is the fact that collecting is now old enough that many cars being restored today are getting their second restorations. So there are a lot of 40, 50, 60-year-old restorations out there, which some people think are original, and there's no sense in preserving an older restoration. And most important, cars reach a certain tipping point. Deterioration and decay cannot be preserved. If you've got a rust hole in a rocker panel, it doesn't mean that you can preserve the car. The car will eventually disappear. You have to deal with that. The car has to be painted, and there's nothing wrong with that at all because it keeps the car in our lives.
Great points. Okay, here's one from John. We know you love classic Aston Martins. Values seem to have reduced recently, where other classics have done the opposite. Why is this, and what's your long-term view?
Well, that's a slightly complicated question because I would say, given the basic attributes of value, the fact that they are high performance but not super high performance, 2+2 cars, their values for a very long time greatly outstripped those of their direct comparables, such as the Maseratis and the 2+2 Ferraris of the period. And I think that we're seeing a settling in those prices, not because the interest has gone down in the cars, but because the interest is not as hot in those cars as it once was. The cars are still amazingly drivable. And in fact, we're seeing now the earlier Aston Martins, the DB24s, which were derided for years as ill-handling trucks. Those values are now rising because people are recognizing the charms of those particular cars for their period and for their time. So I think it's a great example of going back to buy a car for the reasons that the car connects with you, because an Aston Martin DB4 is still a spectacular car to drive, even if they're not trading at their all-time market highs.
It always puzzled me that the Ferrari 2+2s were worth so much less than the two-place cars, especially if you're talking about using them. You want to put your kids in the back. You want to go on family adventures. A 2+2 is a great thing. Why is that? Is that because they're not as beautiful, or they don't have the racing kind of connection?
It is the second, Eddie. It's the fact that the romance of driving a Ferrari for many people is about emulating a race car driver. So you're in a two-seat car. You're in a car which is designed to be impractical, because this is a toy, this is a plaything, and you feel like Gianni Agnelli or Roberto Rossolini when you're driving your two-seater Ferrari. But if you're driving a 2+2 Ferrari, you think, well, gee, who am I, the senior vice president at the Bank of Rome? You know, it's not quite as romantic. But nonetheless, as you said, you can actually take it on a weekend trip, put luggage in the back, take all the things that you buy on the way in the back, and frankly, some of the 2+2 cars with their longer wheelbases and better balance handle better than the two-seater cars. So I've always been GT guy. So, you know, give me a pair of back seats and I'm happy.
And hey, it's a really cheap way to buy a Ferrari. It's only, you know, $500,000 instead of $1 million.
Exactly. A mere bag of shells.
Right, exactly. From Mac. As a young guy who grew up in the bubble, I'd still love to eventually own a first-gen Mustang. Do you think muscle cars will ever get cheap again?
Well, Mac, go back to my earlier answer, which is, yes, there will be inexpensive muscle cars, which are to say those muscle cars which are not the important ones, the ones that are perhaps not as much fun to drive as some others. There are also, frankly, some underrated muscle cars. The AMX 390 is an amazing car. It drives, to my mind, almost as well as a Shelby GT350. It's tight, it handles well, it goes really fast in a straight line and turns. On the other hand, there are some other cars like the Hemi Cuda, which are terrific in a straight line, and they look beautiful, but they were never built particularly well when they were new, and they're not a lot of fun to drive now. So, but then prices coming down are a relative thing. If a Hemi Cuda convertible might have traded for $2 million, if it comes down by half price, it's still $1 million. So it's all relative.
I hear you. Here's a cool one from MBS. What will the impact of the electrification of cars on the market of gasoline internal combustion engine cars be?
Well, that's something that obviously there's a lot of talk about. Personally, I think that the projections of the complete electrification of the automotive fleet are slightly premature, shall we say. And I think that personally that our future is in a mix of pure electric cars, hybrid cars, and fuel cell cars. Now, having said that, I've been asked the question before about the electrification of classic cars and what that means. And for me, so much of the experience of cars, as I mentioned before, about the kinetic aspect of cars is the sound and smell of the internal combustion gasoline engine. Now, that's not to say, obviously, I don't appreciate vintage electrics and steam cars. They have their own particular charms. And there are some cars of the 1960s, I'd probably say, and even the 1970s. Let's just say a Cadillac Coupe de Ville. You could electrify a 1970 Cadillac and not lose much of the essential nature of the car, because it's not about the engine, it's about wafting smoothly. But if you were to put an electric engine into an Aston Martin DB4 Vantage, I think you'd be losing a great deal of what that car is all about. So I don't think that that would be something that I would look forward to, or frankly that the market would reward.
Right. A Rolls Royce, electrify it all day long. But, you know, a 250 short wheelbase, please don't. Well, I think we should leave it on that high note. I thank you so much, Donald. You are absolutely a charming guest and a font of knowledge. And it's great to see your ascent through the hobby. It's really terrific. And thank you for sharing all of this with us today. Thanks for answering our questions. And we will see you at Pebble Beach.
You will indeed. Scant moments from now, Eddie. And thank you again so much for having me. And I look forward to seeing more of these programs.
For sure. Thanks, Donald. I want to remind our guests to, I want to thank them for joining today. And don't forget to join Road and Track's 3-tiered track club for amazing insider benefits. Visit roadandtrack.com/join to sign up. Thank you for your time today, everyone. It was great to host Donald, and we'll see you soon.